Okay, now we come to one of the key moments in the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have a version of this sequence of events in them. John does not, doesn't need to, because the other three already do. This is the moment when Jesus really begins preparing his disciples, his core group of 12 disciples, for the climax of his ministry in Jerusalem, which they're not going to understand, basically, up until it happens, or even afterwards. But this is when he really begins setting them, trying to get them ready for that. Jesus and this is Mark 8, starting in verse 27. Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. This is in the north. On the way, he asked them, "Who do people say that I am?" So he's asking them what the reputation is they've heard of him. They've heard about him from people around. When he says "I am" now, in Matthew, he's going to refer to himself as the Son of Man. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. But we know from comparing these accounts together that he is referring to himself. Because here he says "I." In Matthew, he'll say "Son of Man." So we know that he is referring to himself as the Son of Man, which he's going to do here in a minute, in a few verses anyway, and we will look up what that means. Who do people say I am? They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." That's basically the same thing that we heard about in Mark 6, about the story of John the Baptist's beheading. He had already been beheaded. We don't know really when that happened, but it already had happened by this point. And when word of the apostles' ministry gets out, and Herod hears about it, there are people who say it's either John the Baptist, Elijah, or a prophet. So that's just the word that's going around about Jesus. I don't know what John the Baptist did to develop such a reputation. We really don't know enough about his ministry. None of the Gospels really give us that much information about him. Mark doesn't really cover him at all. But I don't know exactly what he did to develop such an intense, following. But he clearly did something, We read about him just kind of being there one day and the crowds coming out to meet him. We don't even really hear about him going out to the crowds. But he's already been dead for some time now, and his ministry, of course, ended when he was arrested, and that would have even been some time before that. And some people say he's still alive. Some people say he never died. He was just Jesus, and others say Elijah, and still there's one of the prophets. Well, they hadn't had a prophet until John the Baptist came along in over 400 years. The last one was Malachi. The last writing prophet, at least, was Malachi, and they had not had a writing or speaking prophet during that time. In fact, the material they produced during that era, which we call now the Apocrypha, even said that there was no prophet from God in Israel at that time. So John the Baptist's arrival as a prophet and then Jesus following him, that's a big deal. So it's either John the Baptist, Elijah, or one of the prophets. "What about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Christ." Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. Again, the other Gospels will fill in this information somewhat and identify him as the Son of God. Now, it's important to understand here what these men, these 12 guys, these specific individuals that Jesus has here with him at this moment, because they're finally getting their break. By the way, they've been looking ever since the apostles came back from their ministry in Mark 6, when Jesus sent them out in pairs and had them kind of do it. I don't know how long or how extensive it was, but it was basically a practice run for how they were going to minister in the future when he was no longer with them physically. And ever since they got back from that, they've been looking for a break. They've been trying to go on a kind of a retreat, as we would call it today in church terminology today. And they finally got it. They finally made it. They finally got this retreat by going north up to Caesarea Philippi so they could have this conversation and Jesus could start talking to them about his upcoming departure. In their minds, so that's finally happening. That's the context of this trip to Caesarea Philippi and the background of this conversation. In their minds, and even Peter's mind here, when he says you're the Christ, and later Gospels he'll say you're the Son of God. At this point in time, they are still not equating that with him actually being God in the way that we would see later. It's kind of tricky because the Gospels themselves are written later on after the apostles and the people who wrote the Gospel. Matthew and John were apostles. Mark got his material from Peter, who wasn't an apostle. Mark maybe had been present for some of the stuff himself, possibly. Luke was not. He was just an investigator who wrote everything down afterwards. Of course, he was a companion of Paul. By the time they are writing this, they believe that Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of God, and divine. And they already know how it turns out. They know the crucifixion is going to happen. They know the resurrection will follow that. They know the ascension will follow that. They know the commission of the church to go out and follow out. Like from the time 20 or 30 years later, when they're compiling their written accounts and finishing them, and that's what we have today, they already know that. But at this point in the narrative, at this point in time, when this conversation is happening, they don't know that. The apostles that Jesus is talking to at this moment in time do not yet know. They are not seeing Jesus as the Son of God in the sense that we now today often think about him and as being divine, as being God himself in the flesh, God become man. They aren't thinking that. They're thinking of it in terms of the Psalms. Let's go back and read Psalm 2. This is okay. So when we read the Psalms, we read that the Psalms are arranged in this 5-book structure. There's 150 of them, and they're broken up into 5 chunks. And the first chunk is basically all about David, and then it kind of moves from there, and it kind of tells the story of the Old Testament, and it's in narrative, in song form. It kind of tracks the narrative of the Old Testament. You have David. The first part of the Psalm is all about the glory of the king, the royal figure, David and his descendants, who are the sons of God. And then they fall into exile, they turn away from, and then we see that in kind of books 2, 3, and 4. And they come back, and then it gets all celebratory again by the end. Psalm 2, right at the beginning, as the first 2 Psalms are kind of the introduction to the book of Psalms. And this is a royal psalm, an anointing psalm, one that has to do directly with the king of Israel, or Judah, I should say. Psalm 2. Why do the nations conspire, and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers gather together against the Lord, that's Yahweh, that's Jehovah, and against his anointed one. Now, we think of that, we read that, we think of Jesus, which is true. That is ultimately what that refers to, and the rest of the New Testament will clarify that. We'll make that connection clear. But when they would have sung this psalm, the time it was written, whether by David or someone right around his time or afterward, that was 1,000 years. David lived 1,000 years before Peter and Jesus here in Mark. Okay. Whether it was David himself who wrote the psalm or someone shortly after him or one of the musicians in his group or shortly after, when that song would have been sung in the temple, in the first temple, or even later in the second temple, they're singing it about their current king. That's what they're singing. Now, and when Peter sang that song, when Peter and the apostles who were alive and talking with Jesus at that moment in Mark 8, when they sang, up to that point in their lives, when they sang that song, they were thinking about it in terms of the king. That's what that meant to them at that point in time. Let us break their chains, the nations say, and throw off their fetters. But the one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord, that's lowercase L-O-R-D, Lord, so just master, scoffs at them. Then he rebukes them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath, saying, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will proclaim the decree of the Lord. This is the speaker of the psalm. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have become your father. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession. You will rule them with an iron scepter. You will dash them to pieces like pottery. Therefore, you kings, kings of the earth, other kings, rival kings, be wise. Be warned, you rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord, capital L-O-R-D, Israel's God, with fear, and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, that's the king on earth ruling on God's behalf, lest he be angry and you be destroyed in your way. For his wrath can flare up in a moment. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. So that is, and that's what all the Psalms are about. That's the beginning of the Psalms, and that sets the context for all the Psalms. Now we know, of course, in the New Testament, that this is fulfilled ultimately in Jesus. He is that figure. He is the Messiah. He is the Anointed One. He is the Son. He is the King. He is all that. Okay? So that Psalm, Psalm 2, and all the Psalms after that speak of this King, that speak of this ruler, that speak of this Messiah, that speak of the Anointed, that does ultimately find fulfillment in Jesus. But when they would have sung for 1,000 years, when they sang those Psalms, from David down to Peter, they sang it thinking about the King. At this point in time, they don't have a king. They haven't had a rightful king in about 600 years. Their most recent rightful king was Jeconiah, and he was taken away to Babylon in 597 BC. This is about 30 or so AD. So it's been 600 years since they've had a rightful king from the line of David sitting on the throne, ruling as king. They want that again. They want that back. Peter wants that back. Peter, at this point in the story, has made up his mind that this guy, Jesus, is that king. And that's what he's thinking of him. That's what he's thinking he's going to do. He's going to go, at some point, sooner or later, Peter's been following Jesus around now for a couple of years. At some point, sooner or later, Jesus is going to be ready to go into Jerusalem, take it over, and install himself as king. Just like we got done reading in Psalm 2. God says, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy hill. And Peter and the other apostles have made up their minds that this is that guy. But they are not at this point, and they're correct about that. And we'll read in the other Gospels, this one is very brief, very abbreviated, but the other Gospels will read Jesus affirming Peter's declaration here and crediting him for it and saying, you're right. You're right, Peter. So he's not wrong, but he's also not seeing the whole picture yet. He still thinks of Jesus in terms of being the king who's going to restore the line of David and sit on David's throne in Jerusalem and kick the Romans out and make Israel the big bad boys in the block again. And he wants to be part of that. He wants to be part of that kingdom. That is not ultimately what Jesus' kingship is going to look like. Now, Peter will know this later on. And so when Peter preaches to Mark, and Mark writes this down, they have that extra level of proper awareness of Jesus' kingship already in mind. But at this point in the story, Peter does not yet know that. When he says, you're the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God, he is thinking of it in terms of you're the designated king. That's good enough. I mean, that's good. That's right, but it's not enough. So, Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. Now that is because, again, this is a directly political statement. There's already a guy who claims to be king here. We read about Herod the Great. Well, not really, but we're going to read about Herod the Great, Matthew and Luke, who was alive when Jesus was born, and he didn't like it when those wise men came telling him about some other king of the Jews being born. Herod didn't like that. Herod died. Now he has 4 sons who are each ruling part of the area, and each of them thinks that there's king. Actually, I think one of them has been replaced by now. But Herod still has sons ruling different parts of his former territory, and each of them wants to be king. Then you have the Romans, who are really in charge of this territory politically. You've got their governor, their appointed administrator of this region of the world, who reports back to the emperor. So this is a very political, but Peter here is saying that you're the king. Herod Antipas, the current Herod, is not king. His brothers are not king. Pontius Pilate, the governor of Rome, is not reporting as the real king. And Caesar, they're all pretendants. They're all pretenders. Their claims to the throne are not legitimate. You're the real king. Jesus warns us someone about this. This is a directly political statement to make. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man, so now we are referring to Jesus as the Son. We'll read about that term a lot more in Matthew. Not as much here in Mark, but he refers to himself as the Son of Man. And I'll get to that in just a moment. He then began to teach him that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and be raised again after 3 days. He spoke plainly about this, so not in figures of speech, not in cryptic terminology. He sometimes uses cryptic terms. He sometimes uses figures of speech, parables. He answers questions with questions. He doesn't always speak plainly, but he did speak plainly about this. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. How do we get that? He doesn't want his king to be killed. He wants his king to go in there and kill his enemies. That's what he thinks his king should do. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men." Now again, the other Gospels will have an expanded account of this, and it will turn right around from Jesus praising Peter for his confession of him as Christ, and giving him, big thumbs up and pat on the back for that, to turning around and saying, "Get behind me, Satan," adversary. Satan just means adversary, or an enemy. You're an enemy of God right now. He wants to prevent Jesus from dying. He does not want his king to be killed.